So good morning, everyone. It's a lovely morning here, certainly in London, lovely and sunny. I hope it's great where you guys are. Just to cover off what we're talking about today, we're joined by Charles Radclyffe, who's a partner at EthicsGrade. We're going to be discussing the role of data ethics in the era of big data and digital transformation. I will give a brief intro to myself and Charles in a second, and I'll also just run off the kind of a schedule for the talk today. So we're going to be talking for about half an hour. We've got some questions for Charles, and we'll have a little discussion on that for 30 minutes or so, and then we're going to have some time for questions at the end. So we'll have about 15 minutes for questions. So please do ask questions, anything you wish. The talk will be available later for viewing, and so please do share it. We want people to really gain some really good benefits from this. So let's move on to a quick introduction to myself and Charles. Very quickly on me. It's not about me, but my name's Amir Hashmi, and I'm the CEO of zsah Limited. And I'll be talking a bit more about zsah near the end of the talk. I'd rather get into the meat of the topic. And we're privileged to be joined by Charles Radclyffe, who, as I mentioned, is a partner at EthicsGrade. Charles advises organizations on how to develop a strategy of ethical implementation of AI, automation, and robotics. Charles also speaks at various events and has a blog on the ethics and societal impact of emerging technology. In his spare time, he also supports young entrepreneurs in two fields, quantum and agricultural technology. So welcome, Charles. Really nice to see you. Charles and I have known one another for some years, but it's always a huge pleasure to talk. Always. So yeah, welcome, Charles.
Thank you very much, Amir. Thank you. Nice to be here. Nice to be here this morning.
Good. Good one. So just very briefly, the structure of the talk is, I'll be asking Charles some questions, and we'll have a chat about a few different topics. The topics were posted on LinkedIn. All the questions were, and just to cover them now, so you kind of know what's coming up. We're going to be talking about what is data ethics. And why does it matter? We'll be talking about data monetization and what ethical issues are involved with it. We'll be talking about how does Brexit impact us on EU data regulations, such as GDPR, for example. And then we'll be talking about something really interesting, and that is what is a data ethical rating. And then we will also hopefully get on to talking about how we can avoid harm across data disclosure. We hear about incidents happening all the time. So hopefully we'll be able to cover them all. But without further ado, I think we'll get into it. And I'll stop talking as much. And I'll ask Charles, I'll ask you the first question. So yeah, Charles, what is data ethics? And why does it matter?
So a lot of people ask me the question, why, what's different about data ethics or digital ethics to normal ethics? And the answer is nothing. There's nothing different about the topic. What we're interested about is how our actions affect other people and whether that's essentially right or wrong. What's different really about ethics of technology is two things. Firstly, because of the massive interconnectedness we have in the world today, a small team of designers, a small team of technologists, a company who launches a new product can have massive reach, global reach. The WhatsApp team who launched WhatsApp famously when they sold that firm for however many $1 billion it was. I think it was just 7 people at that point. So a small group of people essentially make a big amount of change for all of us. And that's one of the reasons why this really matters. And the second point is, if you think back about technology, all the way back to history, since the first, person made the first tool, out of a bit of branch and a piece of stone, however many thousands of years ago that might have been. Technology is a form of leverage. We use technology to exert power over the world and each other. And, all technology, since that very first spear or that very first tool, is a form of leverage. The difference between artificial intelligence and robotics and automation and the digital transformation technologies we're using today is that the leverage we have, the power that we have, is massive, is really significant. And so it doesn't change the ethical conversation we need to have, but it certainly makes it really, really relevant, essential, in fact, I would argue. And so, it matters because, it touches all of us. It impacts all of our lives.
Interesting. Yeah, that's fantastic. As you said, it's just it's nothing has really changed. It's just how, it's about trust. It's about I think responsibility. All the things that you mentioned. Nothing has changed in that sense in terms of the actual ethics. It's the popularity of data that's bringing it much more to the forefront. And data security, etc., comes into play, because obviously if we're not managing our data ethically, or other people's data ethically, if there are breaches, for example, and then things can be much more high profile. But absolutely, yeah, it's fantastic answer.
And the difficult thing about this is that when we say, is one company managing data ethically, or is another company managing data ethically? The difficulty with ethics is it's the most subjective conversation we could have. I mean, people argue about which football team they support, or which color t-shirts they want to wear, or what cars we drive. There's so many things that we make choices about, subjective choices every day. But the one that really matters is ethics. Everyone has a slightly different worldview. I mean, I've known you, 10 years. We've got, a lot in common, a few differences as well. And that's great. That's what makes the world go round. Yeah. And I think what's really interesting about data ethics is that we have to be very conscious that if we are acting ethically according to our own view of what is ethical, we might very well be impacting other people in a way that they might feel is unethical. And that's the real challenge. And some of the big organizations in the technology industry, Facebook, Amazon, Google, for example, they say, well, we have billions of users, and therefore it's impossible, it's impractical for us to ask all of our users whether they are happy. So therefore we need to have a small team of experts who make that decision on behalf of everyone. I don't think that's a fair excuse. If you're in a privileged position where you've developed something which is so successful that you have billions of users, then yes, the challenge is much greater to incorporate the views and the feedback from those users. But you can't just simply wash your hands of the problem and say, well, because we've got billions of users, we obviously can't take into consideration stakeholder feedback. It's obviously a lot smaller. It's a lot easier for smaller companies. But I think the problem we have in the technology industry today is some of the bigger firms like to wash their hands of the problem because they simply say it's too big a problem for us to worry about.
Sure. And also, it's not a one-off thing, is it? You can't. It's not like we just sort our data ethics out and it's fine. It's an ongoing area that we have to keep on top of and possibly changes. Possibly changes as time goes by. It's not a one-off thing, right? We need to keep an eye on it and
Absolutely.
be proactive with it, right?
Exactly, and I think that's what makes this quite different perhaps to software engineering approaches, or engineering, hardware engineering approaches. Because in the old days, it's quite easy. You built a product, you sold a product, you had a warranty period, and then after that warranty period, it wasn't really your responsibility anymore. And then it was down to the consumer or the user to dispose of that product in a responsible way. And that was it. You didn't have to really worry. You just had to focus on selling another product and making another product. But in the days of we're living in now with artificial intelligence, a product lifecycle is much more complicated than that. So the product that's launched, is something which is typically going to change many times throughout its lifecycle. Even the data that is feeding into the product is going to cause the product to behave differently throughout its lifecycle. And then with software patches, with hardware changes, with firmware updates, with new updated libraries and the machine learning frameworks, this is going to have impact on the behavior of the product. And then when it comes to decommissioning that product at the end of the life cycle, again, ethical choices need to be made or are being made, perhaps sometimes without it being realized. And again, organizations have a responsibility. And there's so many good examples, or so many bad examples, should I say, some good examples of bad practice happening. And I think the risk is if if those examples become too widespread, then it could really limit the uptake of technology. It could really limit the ability for all of us, good actors, good participants in the ecosystem, to have the impact and change that we want to deliver.
Sure. Cool. I will move on to the next question. So let's talk about monetization. So what is data monetization, and what ethical issues are involved with it?
Yeah, that's a big question. It's a big question. So about 10 years ago, when you and I first met, in fact 11 years ago, almost to the day, I was running a data analytics company, and the thing I found over those few years was, we would often get clients coming to us and saying, look, we've got a lot of data on customers, on users, and they look at Facebook, Google, some of the big tech companies, and they kind of instinctively realize that somehow Google is making money somehow out of the data. The products are free, so the only way that the money is being made is out of the data. And I heard so many times organizations say to us, we need help monetizing our data. We're sitting on a gold mine of data, and we really want to be able to monetize this. But I think very, very few organizations have actually successfully made that transition from the old world to the new world of data monetization. There's a very, very, very good guide to this, but it's written from a kind of negative perspective. It's by a lady called Shoshana Zuboff. She's a professor, I think, at Harvard or Yale in the United States. Harvard, I think. And she wrote a great book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And it's a really big book. It's perhaps unnecessarily big and unnecessarily dense. But what she analyzes basically is that the technology companies that monetize data have essentially created a new form of capitalism. And that's basically the kind of contribution that she makes, is this critique of the tech industry. And she basically argues that whereas under traditional capitalism, resources are extracted from the Earth's natural abundance, and essentially, capitalists put workers to work in extracting essentially their energy, their skills, in transforming those resources into things which can then be sold, and that's basically the essence of capitalism. That's kind of, I guess, Marx was probably one of the first writers who kind of analyzed things in that way, and that's the world that we've built up, and that's our economic paradigm. What Zuboff argues is that the technology industry works on a new form of capitalism, where basically the raw material is data. The raw material is data that you and I create through our lives, through our interactions with each other, through our interactions with technology. And essentially the mining that happens, the extraction, the kind of the industrial process, is the extraction of this data and the enrichment of this data by combining it with other forms of data. And the data itself isn't sold. And I think a big misnomer is that companies like Google and Facebook sell data. They don't sell data. In fact, that's the opposite of their business model. Firms that monetize data very, very, very rarely would sell the data. I mean, I think the only examples I can think of there are maybe in the advertising, direct marketing market, which is probably the seedy end of the tech world, where people sell and buy email lists and all sorts of things, or likes on review platforms. I mean, it's really a kind of a bit of a dark and murky place. But really what happens is, the data is used in order to build profiles of individuals, of personas, and then that's used to then target advertising and target marketing. And so many business models have been built up on the basis of, if we can just suck people in, attract people in through this honeypot of getting them to freely give up their data, this enables us to, build up a vast, quantity of data that we can then use for other purposes. And these examples are everywhere. So, for years we've been used to these annoying security workflows when we sign up for something. Are you a robot? Prove it by clicking on the bicycles in this picture. Or type in these hard to read letters or numbers. What we're doing in that case is we are proving we're not a robot by doing that. But what we are doing is we're providing a free data set to the company that's asking us those questions, that they can then use to put to use. And in cases of like looking for pictures of bicycles or traffic lights or trucks or buses in pictures, what we're doing is essentially we're training the self-driving cars of the future to be able to recognize those things. And we're all doing it, spending 5 seconds a day perhaps, times however many millions or billions of us are doing that. That's a significant amount of work that we're providing for free to the technology industry. So that's really, I would say, the kind of classic case of data monetization for firms that there's two types of firms. There's firms which are starting up with a good idea, like my company, EthicsGrade. We've started up, and like any technology company, we need data. And so I think if you're starting up and you're looking at launching a business, you've got to think about where is the valuable data to be found, and how do you acquire that data. And then I think at the same time you also need to think about the ethical impact of that, and that is, I would say, the most important first step that you need to make. But for incumbent businesses, for organizations that already exist and are looking to transform, it's a much more difficult job, because, and this is the point that Zuboff makes in her book, is that she argues that the problem with what she calls surveillance capitalism, this idea of collecting data on users and citizens in order to extract value, is it's just a vastly superior business model. And so the difficulty really for classical businesses, traditional capitalist businesses, is that to transition to that surveillance capitalism model is potentially quite difficult. It may require rethinking your fundamental business model in doing so, and it may be requiring offering the very thing that you used to charge for free. And that might be a very difficult leap for a lot of people to make. I mean, think journalists and newspapers. I mean, the idea of news becoming free is exactly what's killed the newspaper industry. The internet has provided news to all of us for free, so we therefore don't buy newspapers anymore. And for newspapers, that's a really big problem. And so data monetization is, I guess, an attractive goal, but it comes with challenges. And I think the problem for those organizations who are trying to transition from the old world to the new world is that they are very vulnerable to attack from players in the technology industry. And I think it's Mark Andreessen, the founder of Netscape, one of the first internet browsers. His quote was, "Software is eating the world," and it's a very interesting quote, and it's a very good insight into the Silicon Valley mindset. That if you're Facebook or Amazon or Google, and you decide, do you know what, we're going to get into the personal transportation business. Taxis are rubbish. We're gonna just like totally change that. Or food delivery is really rubbish. You have to get like a telephone book, and forget that. Let's transform that. Because they're starting from a totally different place, and because they're starting from scratch and they're thinking about data and how to monetize that data, it actually makes it very, very difficult for incumbent businesses to compete. And therein lies the challenge and the opportunity for everyone.
Oh, awesome, excellent. That's fantastic. It's we get asked that question a lot about data monetization, and how I certainly get asked sometimes. I've got a business, and this is someone else talking to me, and I get asked, you know, how can I monetize the data, right? We're dealing with data. How can I do it? It's almost like, you know, it's an opportunity just to get it, but they haven't taken into account the ethics, you know, the rights and wrongs around doing so, and they also haven't taken into account some of the things that hopefully we're just going to talk about with regards to, you know, the data ethics framework and GDPR. They, you know, it's just how can I do this? And we need to kind of rewind the conversation, and kind of let's not talk about this, your specific business model. Let's talk about what you're doing and what you're trying to achieve, and you know, will you actually benefit from being able to sell that data and actually build any kind of consistent revenue stream as well from that data? Because selling data, as you just mentioned, you know, people do monetize data, but monetizing data is normally based on volume. When you need to have big volumes to make anything significant. But the important question is it right? Is it right? What you're doing, is it ethical?
Yeah.
But let's move on to the next question. Sorry, I've got a bit of a throat. Can you talk about? Can you tell us a bit about the data ethics framework, please? I think people will be really interested to hear more about that.
Yeah. So the data ethics framework is something which is was published by the Digital Service of the UK government a couple of years ago, to 2018, I think, maybe. So three years ago, in response to GDPR, and a kind of practical guide for organisations to use to kind of navigate this area without needing to consult with experts. And I think it does a great job. What amazes me, frankly, you know, it's a 38-page, very easy to use document. You know, unlike the kind of government documentation that, you know, you might be used to kind of flinging your tax forms or tax returns. They've done a really good job of making it, you know, super easy to understand, super easy to read, and, you know, quite practical to follow. And I think the government, the UK government digital service is a quality part of UK government. UK government, you know, as much as those of us in the UK like to complain about what our government does, I'm sure, like everyone else in other parts of the world do. The one thing we've really done well is our digital transformation of government services. We've, you know, if you can think back to how bad it was in the 80s and 90s, or before that, you know, in terms of how bureaucratic our system was, how much form filling there was, how many telephone systems you had to, you know, spend forever listening to, or how many queues at council offices you had to enter in order to kind of get anything done. You know, we're living in a very different world now. We've done a really good job of making so many aspects of our interaction with civil society, you know, automated and digitally driven. And so this kind of falls in, I think, into a kind of tradition of, you know, really good work that the government digital service has done in the UK. The problem with it, I'm just stunned by how few people have read it. and not just small businesses. I mean, I think for me, you know, if people are running a small business, it would be the first thing I would point them to, particularly if you haven't got, you know, a budget for consultants and experts to come in. You know, there's a lot of stuff you can do yourself, and, you know, this is, you know, a couple of hours read on a weekend, and then, you know, you can go into work the next week with a very clear plan of what you need to do differently. But what really staggers me is how many large organizations haven't read it, and particularly people in, you know, data protection, data security, data analytics roles. You know, the number of CTOs I speak to who talk about, you know, data protection, data governance, and you ask them, have you read the UK's guidance on this? And you get a blank look. And I just find that really quite a shame, because it is so accessible, it is so easy to read. And so for me, as a practitioner in this space, it's really the kind of foundational starting point. You know, you've got the legal requirements such as GDPR, and this is all about to change again. The bad news is so many people thought that GDPR was the end of the story. It's just the beginning. So, you know, right now GDPR is the bedrock we will build on. And then the data ethics framework is essentially, you know, some really good, easy, clear guidance on, you know, how to implement that, and how to go above the bare minimum requirements, and how to be, a good organization, and also to score oneself on your maturity. And I think that's really helpful and really important. Again, I would say that because I'm in the ratings industry, but
I mean, that's why you're in it, because it's important, right? I think that but just briefly on the data ethics framework, I think that's a really, really good explanation about it. And I just to all the viewers, everyone listening, I think both Charles and I agree that you should all just have a look through it. And if you're in the industry, so if you're in data and analytics, anything to do with data, then you must know about it and know its contents. I'm mindful of time, so it's 10:25, so we've got 5 minutes left of the talk, and then we'll move on to questions. So I wanted to ask you, you just mentioned about kind of ethical rating. So can you explain to our viewers what is a data ethical rating? Yeah, and can you maybe give us some real life examples as well, if possible?
Yeah, sure. Well, firstly, small plug for my business, EthicsGrade.io. And if you go to our website, you can see for yourself exactly what I'm about to describe. So, ratings, if you think about ratings, generally we come across ratings throughout our lives. Credit ratings are perhaps the most widely understood. If you want to get a credit card or a loan or a mortgage, you have to interact with the credit ratings industry. And essentially what the finance industry has done is assessing individuals, likelihood that they're going to be trustworthy from a credit perspective. And so, a lot of people are touched by those. It's a very big industry. And it's not just individuals, not just people, it's also companies as well. But obviously, credit isn't the whole story, and financial performance isn't the whole story. Organizations have impact on the world. People have impact on the world in many other ways. And right now, one of the biggest things that organizations are facing scrutiny for isn't necessarily their financial performance as an organization, but it's their non-financial performance. And these are things like their impact on climate change, their impact on diversity, inclusion, their impact on pollution, plastic pollution, human rights. There's a whole taxonomy of issues which organizations have a responsibility for. And so we call this, in the finance industry, we call this ESG, environmental, societal governance. And it's a very big set of things. It's got everything from climate change to plastic pollution to human rights and beyond. And so within that, the spirit of that, there's lots of organizations who are providing rating services. So if you want to know which is the most eco airline, for example, that might sound a very strange thing to say, but if you want to know which is the most eco airline, there's organizations like Sustainalytics who provide that analysis. And on sites like Yahoo Finance, that information is freely available to people. So if you're interested in investing in companies or interested in as a consumer in buying from companies, and you want to understand their kind of impact on the world, their non-financial impact on the world, that data is available. And to the investment community, that's very important. Because obviously if you're investing in airlines or investing in oil companies, you want to know, which of them are going to have more negative focus from activists and campaigners, and therefore which of them might be more reputationally challenged by those issues.
Sure.
And so the same is very true for data ethics and the ethics of technology. And, we are all familiar with some of the big, the oil slicks of the tech industry, are things like Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. That is a highly significant data ethics problem. Even through to British Airways or Marriott hotels with their data breaches, or almost every day I'm reading about ransomware attacks. Companies which are being hacked, their data is being locked up because they haven't secured it, and then they have to decide: do we try to rebuild our business without the data, or do we pay the hackers who are obviously connected with criminal activity? I mean, it is criminal activity. So do you pay criminals essentially to get your data back? And that's an ethics issue as well. And so essentially what we do is we rate organizations on a whole bunch of factors, which, and essentially companies which score well against our model, you can say follow best practice. They have good governance in place. They have, the examples of good that we see, they've implemented it. And companies which score badly on our model, we don't see evidence of those good things. And of course, for some organizations, it's simply because they haven't communicated anything. They may well be doing some really great work, but they just simply might not be communicating that particularly well. And so what we do is, before we publish a rating, we write to an organization, share our assessment of them, and invite them to have a conversation with us and to put us right, essentially, if there's anything that we've missed out.
Yeah, exactly.
And we don't charge for that. That's part of what makes us, I think, ethical about what we do and make the data quality that we have high. And I think what's interesting about this is right now I think we're at the early stages of where consumers and investors might start investing or buying based on organizations which are more ethical. I think right now a few people do this, but I think in the next 5-10 years many of us are going to be making those choices much more actively. In the same way as we make those choices, we may go out of our way to shop because it's more green. But also it's going to become law. And I think this is the key thing. I've mentioned that GDPR is the bedrock of a lot of data ethics frameworks. But the European Commission are sharpening their teeth to go after big tech. And what we've seen already is we've seen 3 new pieces of regulation being proposed by the European Commission, the Data Governance Act, the Digital Services Act, and the Digital Markets Act. And that's about to be joined with a 4th piece of regulation next month in April. April 21st was when we're expecting it to come out, and that will be on AI specifically. And so what we're going to see over the next few years is requirements on the tech industry or non-tech companies who are implementing technology to label their products and to label their services, much in the same way as when you go to a cafe, you see a food hygiene rating, or much in the same way when you buy a fridge, you see an energy efficiency rating. So we're going to start to see labeling of systems become a legal requirement in certain instances. And so what we've essentially done is built something which helps answer that question, that regulatory demand, in a way that's very, very easy for organizations to implement.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. And like you said, it's obviously really good to hear about EthicsGrade, and obviously the reason you're doing it is because you're passionate about it, and you can see the requirement coming up. Obviously, you can see it's here already, and it's going to become law, as you were saying. But what I've always liked about how you've kind of approached EthicsGrade is the passion that you've got around this. There's and your team. I've had the kind of privilege to meet some of your team as well. You've got some really good people working with you. So hats off to you for that.
Thank you.
We've gone over. we've gone a bit over. What we'll do now is I think I'll just say thanks very much, Charles. I think this brief kind of half an hour or so, I'm hoping has been really useful for everyone that's listening. I think it's definitely got people's minds whirring, because data ethics again is something that's not even people within the data industry are not fully cognizant of it. Or they don't necessarily take it into account as much as I think they should, and I think you probably agree with me on that. So hopefully it's got your interest as a listener. You can reach out. You can reach out to Charles. You can reach out to myself. We're here to talk. Right? We're here to help. So just quickly, I'll give you a quick brief introduction on us in case you haven't heard about us. So very, very quickly, zsah, we are a managed technology company, and we specialize in everything cloud, so public cloud, private cloud. We've got our own cloud, global cloud platform where we operate huge applications, complex applications, high speed, and private applications. We specialize in DevOps and data ops, and we have a data and analytics division. So we do various bits of work around data. So this is obviously a subject that's close to my heart as well. What we'll do now is we will move on to questions. We have a few questions that have come through. So what I will do is, if you just bear with me, I'll just load them up. So we have, all right, so we've got a question here that's come through. It says, which types of data need to be handled with care? There's lots of data in the world. We deal with lots of data, but which types of data need to be handled with care? That's the question that's come.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think the point is that today in the sort of 2020s, the answer is going to be all data needs to be handled with care, because all data is potentially valuable as an asset to your firm. So, the question, if you take away the word data and replace it with, asset, or stock, it's like saying, to a supermarket, which of our stock should we handle with care? Well, the answer is all of it. Yes, the organic fruit and veg might be the most expensive things you're selling, or the organic meat might be the things which are, have the shortest, shelf life. But at the end of the day, if you're denting tins of baked beans, you're going to make it more difficult to sell it. And if you're also letting, your stock rot out in the warehouse, or you're letting people nick it without paying for it, then you're wasting your opportunity. So the answer is all data, starting point, and then within that context of all your data, then there's, I think, beyond that, you've got a particular responsibility for things which are personally identifiable information. So categories, data where information about an individual that makes it personally identifiable, you have a particular responsibility towards. But the problem lies is, even if you strip out PII, even if you strip out person I can't even say it this morning, it's Friday, even if you strip out PII, there are data sort of de-anonymization techniques whereby you can essentially play the detective game and figure out potentially who was the underlying source of that data. And so you've got to think beyond simply the kind of requirements. And best practice, and this is what we recommend, is you have something which we call a red team. Basically a bunch of people who look at what you're doing and think the question, how can this go wrong? In what way could this go wrong? What bad outcomes haven't we considered? And I would encourage anyone, even if you're a very small organization, it's just one person. You pick the person who always asks the awkward questions. That person is the ideal person to have as a one-man or one-woman red team. And that's the person you should be asking, where could this go wrong? And as a consequence, you can then think through which data we should protect more than others. But I still can't say it. Personal identifiable information is like top of the list without question.
Absolutely.
Obviously, if you're in a regulated industry, you've got a whole set of other challenges to think about. But all data is important, and all data should be thought about as an asset.
Yeah. Thank you. It's a good question. It's a good question because it's like you say, it is all data, and then there's regulation that controls that, and then we actually get asked this kind of question quite often, especially in healthcare. So there are a lot of I think the NHS in general and a lot of healthcare professionals, they're understanding regulation better now, but they're also now getting to grips with kind of the ethics side of things. From what we see, I'm sure there are very a lot of much maturer kind of people that have got a much maturer attitude towards it. But we do get asked this question still. It's funny, there's no specific answer, right? Although, as you said, all data, but there are different levels, isn't on there? So, and it depends on your industry, predominantly on the industry that you're working in. Interesting. So we've got another question. Sorry, Charles.
We can. I can back that up with data as well. I mean, we cover a whole range of different industries, 20 so far in the industries we've rated, and I think what's really good to see is that those organizations in some of the highest scoring organizations that we've found in our ratings are those in the biotech healthcare space. And I guess why is that? I think for a couple of reasons. One, because it's a regulated business, and I think those organizations in regulated businesses, they just have an extra layer of understanding around the importance of governance. And secondly, I think they also, when we talk about data science, when the rest of the technology talks about data science, we use that term quite glibly. When I think of science, I think about people in white coats and test tubes and sterile clean room environments. That's science to me. It's like something which is really quite professional, and to become a scientist requires many years of training and apprenticeship, etc. But data science is a little bit kind of it's a bit amateur. I'm sorry to all the data scientists listening, but it's true, and you'll probably admit it if you're a data scientist listening to this. And so I think a lot of other industries who look at these things just don't have the same level of professionalization where it comes to how they think about the engineering controls that they need around these things. So I guess I'm not really surprised to see pharmaceutical industry performing really well compared to some other industries that you'd kind of hope or expect to do better, perhaps.
Sure. Yeah, no, I understand. That's good. Yeah, fantastic. We've got one more question. We've got about 4 minutes left. I've got one more question to ask. I think in this time there's a few more, but we'll ask this one. So, so what new practices can we develop to support the ethical use of data and open source information?
That's a big question. So. Where do I even start with that? So I guess there's a few things. There's law, but law is slow. I mentioned Netscape, and Netscape Navigator, I think was the first internet browser that included a cookie technology. This was in about 1995. GDPR came into force in 2018. So there's 20-year gap between those two things, and so we can't wait for the law to catch up. That's point one. Second point is that we do have standards emerging, and particularly right now around AI, there's a lot of industry initiatives around standards, but again, standards are quite slow. They tend to be industry led, or they tend to be, if they're not industry led, they're academically led. And so while they're very well thought through, they're not necessarily fully reflective of the anxieties that ordinary people have. And I think really it's that next piece that's important is, how do you address stakeholder concerns? And, it's one of the things that we thought when we were designing our model, we thought very carefully about why do we have a tech clash? Why is it that in 2011, Mark Zuckerberg was Time Person of the Year? And in 2018, he was sitting in front of Congress. What happened? What went wrong in those 7 years? Because it wasn't just that Facebook screwed up in those 7 years. It was that public opinion changed against Facebook in those 7 years. And the question of whether Facebook will recover from that is an open question. And I think one thing that has gone wrong is that the tech industry, and not just the tech industry, but other firms who are implementing technology, haven't paid enough attention to what ordinary people wants from technology, and they haven't done what we would call stakeholder participatory initiatives or stakeholder feedback exercises. And it's very simple. It's just about asking people, what their concerns are, and having a mechanism of listening and addressing those concerns. Obviously, it's very difficult if you've got 1 billion users, but that's not an excuse. If you've got 20 users, 20 customers, it's much easier to do. And if you do that, I think then you do become inherently ethical as an organization, because you are essentially making sure that the ethical concerns that your customers, your marketplace has, you're reflecting back into your product. And I think we're going to start to see a lot more emergence around solutions in that field. There are a couple of disciplines already. Nesta, another UK organization, they have a playbook on something called collective intelligence. which is a way of doing this. It's not, I would say they do a great job of trying to break down the how, but it's not quite reached the point where it's very simple to implement. And I think, many small organizations might struggle as a result. But I think that's the key thing we're going to start to see. We're going to see organizations fall over themselves to try and really pay attention to what stakeholders want, and other organizations just simply put experts in place to try and do that by proxy.
Okay, cool. There's I know we've just hit 10:45, but there's one more question that if we can squeeze in, maybe it's going to be difficult to do a quick answer to it, but I'll raise it anyway. So I didn't mention names earlier, but Michael asks, do we see Matt Hancock or NHS Digital wanting to use more health data for monetization?
It's a great question. So I don't know Matt Hancock. I'm sure he's a lovely bloke. But there's and the NHSX, the innovation function, I think have got a very difficult job, like anyone else associated with a health service right now. So I will try and be as uncritical as I can be here. But I think what went wrong last year with the COVID results, and they're kind of blaming it on a use of Excel. They were using Excel 97 or Excel 2003 or something. This is just unforgivable. Unforgivable. And I think there's a real danger, and I think what this shows is not just necessarily a problem within the NHS or within government in general, but also a problem across many organizations, across many different industries. And that's technology and data governance is essential to how organizations perform and succeed, but also how organizations face reputational harm. And the problem is that leadership in many organizations, people who've become leaders of their industry, whether it's in the airline industry or the food industry or transport or supermarkets or whatever industry we can think about, they've grown up in a time where technology wasn't the thing that necessarily got them to the top. And so what you really need to have is ensure that you've got very, very strong technologists around you, and that they are inputting into the strategy, and that there's a direct connection between that corporate strategy and the people on the ground. And I think what happened with the NHS and the COVID results in the Excel was evidence that just simply broke down. And then I think we saw the sort of squirming in the House of Commons about the incident, and a kind of sort of brushing off of that incident as evidence that the people at the top didn't really get it. And so I guess my concern with Matt Hancock, having come from DCMS and moving into the health service, is he probably should have known better. And he, for someone who kind of essentially running the government's technology, digital aspect, he really ought to have maybe had better advice around him or thought about this, and certainly consulted with a few technologists before kind of brushing off the incident. Why do I kind of use this as an answer to the story? Because I think in order to use health data for monetization, you've got to get the basics right first. And I would be deeply concerned if the NHS Digital was trying to do anything on a more advanced end of the scale until it got some of the basics in place. I think one of the things that's really interesting just around health data is we're going to start to see a big kind of battleground being drawn around this, where we're seeing private companies, in the technology industry like Apple and Amazon, etc., Google, collect health data. So if you own an Apple Watch, it's essentially collecting all sorts of biometric telemetry, from you wearing it. There's lots of really interesting innovation from how you can analyze someone's health by looking at a camera of their skin and detecting their pulse rate and all sorts of other things. You can do so much really interesting things from data. It's not at clinical standards, so the accuracy of some of this data collection is not anywhere near the same grade as you'd get in a hospital. But the thing is, if you're in hospital, most of us hopefully only ever go to hospital a couple of times in our lives. And so we're only monitored by data collection technology for a few hours or a few days at most throughout our entire lives. and the rest of the time it's the odd health checkup when we go to the GP and he measures or she measures your heart rate or your blood pressure. So you get these kind of very very precise but very, very infrequent health data collection intervals. But then from the technology that we use, Amazon Alexa is listening to us all the time. If you're wearing an Apple Watch, it's collecting data on you all the time, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think what we're going to see is we're going to start to see the health predictive capability from technology companies start to outperform what you can get from a hospital through highly accurate machines, but only the ones that have a snapshot of information about you.
Sure.
And I think this is going to be really interesting. I say interesting from an academic perspective. It's a very interesting problem to navigate, because that is going to create commercial opportunities for those non-clinical systems. It's going to create huge opportunities commercially. And I think what organizations like the NHS have to think about is, to what extent do we enable that kind of public data, the kind of the public health data, the kind of the high grade stuff that's on all of our health records, to be mashed together with that. And I think we've seen a few examples of controversy where, I think it was the Royal Free Hospital in London sold essentially some patient data to Google for research purposes. I think we're going to see a few more controversies like that. And I think this is going to be a really key battleground: is what is the role of the private sector when it comes to public health, and what is the role of the public health agency, in this case the NHS, in terms of the data collection they can have.
Yes.
I mean, one final point about this. I mentioned earlier European regulations. Obviously, it doesn't really touch us directly in the UK anymore. But I think there's a lot we can learn and watch from what's happening in the European Commission. And one thing the European Commission has done much better than we've done over here is their data strategy, their digital strategy is much more advanced. I think we are going to see a data strategy in the UK at some point this year, which would be great. But one of the things that the European Commission has started to do is to look at this question of public data, and how that public data might be shared with other organizations, and how that sharing might be revoked by the individual data subject. And this is all in the Data Governance Act. And I always call this kind of GDPR Part 2. And I think this whole question about how do we build an ecosystem, how do we build a marketplace for data, health data, is going to be something which the European Union is going to answer before we answer in the UK. They're just simply a few more years ahead than us. And I would say for those of us in the UK, we should continue with our own strategy. We should really think about this opportunity, and how do we want to build public-private partnerships around data for public health. And at the same time, we should really watch what's going on in Europe very closely, and try to adopt as much of the good stuff and avoid some of the bad stuff as we possibly can. And I think it's going to be a really, really exciting decade for those of us working in the data space. So really great question, Michael, and love to talk more about it if you're interested afterwards.
Yeah, awesome, excellent, no, fantastic. So thanks everyone for hanging on for a bit longer. We will wrap up now. So it's all that's left for me to say is thank you, Charles. I think it's been fantastic. I think this is just the tip of the iceberg. I think there's so much more conversation to be had specifically around data ethics. Really good to hear about EthicsGrade. You guys, everyone that's listening, thanks for listening. And if you want any more information, then feel free to contact Charles, contact me. We're always happy to talk. And help. So I hope everyone has a great day. Have a good weekend, and do share this webinar with anyone you think may be interested. And hopefully it's stimulated you and benefited you in some way. But thanks a lot, Charles. Always good to speak. And thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.